In the next offseason, John Wall will net the Houston Rockets a future first-round pick through trade. Yo guys, what's going on? Today we're going to talk about how the best case scenario for the Houston Rockets can lead to John Wall being traded next offseason for a first-round pick. Now, what is this best case scenario? Now, to get started, I know a lot of Rockets fans want John Wall out of Houston, mainly because he's taken up playing time from our future, and we would rather see our young guns getting the ball, getting the minutes, and just playing our game through them. But let's be honest, trading John Wall would mean getting rid of him plus some of our assets, and that is not what you want to do for a rebuilding team. John Wall will stay with the Rockets at least for one more year. But what is this best case scenario? To understand this scenario completely, I point to you Chris Paul's situation with the Thunder. Think about it, before that year, Chris Paul was considered washed. Many people thought that he would play out his contract and then probably retire or just go ring chase as a role player on a contender. But that year, Chris Paul was not only able to turn around his own career, but he was able to turn around what people thought of the Thunder that year. In fact, I'm sure all Rockets fans remember, we met them in the first round and they took us to 7 games. Now, we weren't the greatest of teams that year, but we were still a pretty good team. But that team in general was really great, and it was all because of Chris Paul. Now, I'm not saying that John Wall is Chris Paul, but he is kind of in a similar situation as the point guard. Going into his second year with the Rockets, he is surrounded by young talent, he is surrounded by young stars, and he's surrounded by decent vets, including Daniel House, Daniel Theis, Christian Wood, and Eric Gordon. Kinda similar to the Thunder when they had Chris Paul, they had Danilo Gallinari, they had Dennis Schroeder. But what made that season so special for Chris Paul wasn't his points, wasn't his assists, but it was his leadership and the amount of games they won. Going into that season, I think they had less than a 1% chance of making the playoffs. Well, they shut everyone up and were the 5th seed that year. Let's be honest, they blew out expectations that they probably even set for themselves. Now, I'm not saying John Wall has to lead the Rockets to the 5th seed this year, but if he was to make the playoffs, I think that would completely change the narrative around John Wall, and the media would flip his image more to what Chris Paul did. Going into the season, John Wall is 30 years old. He's coming off a year where he averaged 20.5 points per game, 7 assists per game, and 3 rebounds per game. But the reason his season wasn't as great as his previous ones were because of his shooting splits. He shot 32% from 3 and he shot 40% overall from the field. Those splits are just not great and not something you really want from a star. But if you go look at Chris Paul's season with the Thunder, it was honestly statistically not that great. He averaged 17.5 points, averaged 6.5 assists, which was actually a career low, averaged 5 rebounds, but his shooting splits were decent. He shot 37% from 3 and 49% overall. Now, what that tells me is when people were evaluating Chris Paul, they didn't give a damn about his stats. I mean, he had a career low in assists, something that he's supposed to be notorious at, yet people had a high value for him. In fact, he made the All-Star team in the West as a point guard. That's still pretty impressive. And many people thought what Chris Paul did for the Thunder, he could do for their own team. Well, if Wall would have a similar season, similar success path that Chris Paul did have for the Thunder, why not? We have great young talent, we have solid veterans, a great coach, a solid GM, and an amazing organization. If John Wall can get his mental psyche back into the game of basketball and have the shooting splits he had in his previous career, I think his stock would skyrocket. But the biggest reason Chris Paul's value in the trade market was so high was because his contract went from a 2-year cap space burner type to a 1-year offload contract. Now, what this meant was if a team like the Suns did invested in Chris Paul, only giving up a first-round pick, the risk would be super low, but as we were shown last year, the rewards would be super high. Now, the risk was low because all it took was a first-round pick, and at worst, they'd be on the hook for Chris Paul for 1 more year. And the reward was just a positive impact from Chris Paul, who completely changed both the mentality and the position of the organization as a whole. Now, I don't think John Wall is the same player and the same leader that Chris Paul is, but he can be. He can get to that level because he knows what it takes to make the playoffs, he knows what it takes to be an all-star, and he knows what it takes to win games. If John Wall can fully invest himself into this team and into this season, next offseason, he will be in a similar situation as Chris Paul. He has 1 year left on his contract, a team that might be desperate to make a push in the playoffs or push into the playoffs might be willing to take a flyer for a first round pick for John Wall. And if a team is desperate enough and they think that John Wall is the missing piece for them to either become a contender or to even make a push into the playoffs, then why not make the trade for a first round pick? It's low risk, high reward. And the 4 teams that really come to mind who are in that position, going from the bottom to the top, is first the Boston Celtics. I know Boston have a rough history with veteran point guards who come in and they just disappoint or stay injured. But let's say it happens again, Dennis Schroeder doesn't work out, Marcus Smart at point guard doesn't work out, then Boston has quite a bit of pressure to make a move. Grabbing John Wall and just experimenting for a year is not the worst case scenario. The next team is the Philadelphia 76ers. As much as I don't like Ben Simmons and Embiid being together, I think they're running back 1 more year and again fail. Next offseason will be a better offseason to make a trade, and maybe Ben Simmons can recoup some of the value he lost in this year's playoffs. If that is the case, I could see a 3-team trade where they grab John Wall just for a year, see how he and Embiid can work together, and if that works out, great. The second team I think is the Clippers. Clippers have been on the cusp of getting to the finals, on the cusp of trying to win a championship, but they haven't quite reached that threshold yet. If Kawhi comes back healthy this year and they still fail, I think they could be in for a big move this offseason, one of which is grabbing John Wall. There's tons of rumors this past offseason, and the fact that the Lakers somehow managed to get Westbrook, I wouldn't put it behind Steve Ballmer and his deep pockets to take on John Wall. Lastly is the New Orleans Pelicans. Similar to the Suns, the Pelicans have 2 really bright young stars, and it seems like they're 1 piece away from either getting into contention or making the playoffs. Now, I'm not saying John Wall can have the same effect as Chris Paul, but putting him on the Pelicans would give them another star, and if the rumors are true about Zion wanting out of New Orleans, this could also put pressure on the front office to make a desperate move for a player like John Wall on an expiring contract. Your team probably doesn't want John Wall and his $47 million, but the fact of the matter is, it's just a 1-year deal. Why not take a flyer and see how far you can get? Look how well it worked for the Suns and Chris Paul. I honestly think this next season, John Wall will get his shit together, he will play really well, and he'll try to win games as much as possible. And if he can do that, if he can keep his efficiency up, I think John Wall's stock will skyrocket and we can trade him for a first round pick in the next offseason. Do you think he plays out his contract with the Houston Rockets, or do you think he gets moved in the next offseason? Let me know in the comments below. Other than that, please like the video, hit the subscribe button, and see ya!